Tony, a veteran searching for peace, believed an old map was his key to the truth. With his four-legged companion, Ted, he followed the cryptic symbols to a remote mine entrance, sealed shut by earth and rock. But as they drew near, his dog, Ted, suddenly froze, whining and clawing desperately at the earth. A foul, overpowering stench, a mix of chemicals and decay, seeped through the cracks. Tony realized the map hadn't just led him to an abandoned mine. He was standing at the entrance to a tomb, and the men who created it knew he was getting dangerously close. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the West Virginia mountains was a living thing. It was a dense, heavy quiet, woven from the sigh of wind through ancient hardwoods and the distant caw of a raven. For Tony, that silence was medicine. It was the balm he applied to the ringing in his ears, a phantom echo from a life he fought every day to leave behind. His morning started not with an alarm, but with a wet nose pressing gently against his hand. Tony opened his eyes to see Ted, his German shepherd, sitting patiently by the side of the cot, tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the worn wooden floorboards of the cabin. Tony was a man etched by his past. In his late 30s, he was tall and lean, carrying the wiry strength of someone who had spent years pushing his body to its limits. His short brown hair was beginning to surrender to threads of silver at the temples, a premature gray that matched the look in his eyes. His face, framed by a perpetual layer of dark stubble, was rugged, carved with lines of hardship, but a fundamental kindness softened his features when he looked at the dog. He swung his legs out of bed, the cool mountain air raising goosebumps on his skin, and pulled on his standard uniform, a gray t-shirt, faded blue denim jeans, and a plaid flannel shirt of navy, gray and pale beige, that he left unbuttoned. Ted watched his every move. The dog was a magnificent animal, about 5 years old, with a thick coat that was more wolf than shepherd. His fur was a rare mix of silver and gray, with darker sable markings along his back and a stark white patch on his chest. He wasn't a pet. He was a partner. Ted was a silent keeper of secrets, a steady presence who had anchored Tony through the worst of the storms that still raged in his mind. He was the only living soul who had seen Tony at his weakest, and his loyalty was the one thing in the world Tony held as an absolute truth. All right, I'm up," Tony murmured, his voice raspy with sleep. He ran a hand over Ted's broad head, a simple gesture of gratitude that passed between them every morning. After a simple breakfast of coffee and oatmeal, they set out. This was their ritual, a long, meandering exploration of the vast wilderness that surrounded their isolated patch of land. It was here, in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, that the ghosts of his military past grew quiet. The sharp crack of a falling branch didn't send him diving for cover anymore. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves replaced the metallic tang of sand and cordite that had haunted his dreams for years after he left the service in 2019. Ted moved ahead, his paws silent on the mossy ground. He was not a frantic dog. His temperament was as calm and observant as Tony's. He moved with a purpose, his nose twitching, reading the story of the forest that was invisible to human eyes. They walked for nearly an hour, climbing a gentle ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the rolling Appalachian peaks, hazy and blue in the distance. They were following a faint deer trail that wound through a section of the forest Tony hadn't explored as thoroughly. The trail skirted a property line marked by a crumbling stone wall, a relic from a farmer a century ago. It was on the edge of this property that their peace was broken. A man stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, moving with a surprising quickness for his age. He was wiry and weathered, his face a road map of wrinkles under a stained baseball cap. He held an old but well-kept hunting rifle, held casually in the crook of his arm, not pointing but present. His eyes were small, suspicious, and fixed on Tony. "You're on my land," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. It wasn't a question. Tony immediately stopped and raised a placating hand. Ted, sensing the tension, had frozen beside him, a low, barely audible rumble starting in his chest. "Easy, Ted," Tony said softly. He looked back at the old man. "Apologies, we were just following the trail. Didn't see any signs." "Don't need signs. People ought to know what's theirs and what ain't," the man grumbled. "This is my property. Name's Walter, and I don't care for visitors." "Understood, Walter," Tony said, his voice even. "We'll turn back. No trouble intended." Walter's suspicious gaze didn't waver. He took in Tony's appearance, then Ted's, his lips tightening into a thin line. "See that you do. This ain't a place for sightseeing. Some things in these woods are best left alone." With a final distrustful glare, Walter turned and melted back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. The encounter left a sour taste in Tony's mouth. It wasn't just the man's hostility, it was the veiled warning in his words. It made him an instant object of suspicion in Tony's mind. Tony gave Ted's flank a reassuring pat. "Come on, boy. Let's find a different route." They cut away from the property line, heading deeper into the unclaimed state forest. The unease from the encounter with Walter began to fade, replaced again by the calming rhythm of their hike. It was Ted who found it. About 15 minutes later, the dog suddenly stopped. His ears swiveled forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. He wasn't looking at an animal or sniffing a trail. He was staring intently up ahead, through a break in the trees. "What is it, Ted?" Tony asked, his own senses suddenly on high alert. He moved up beside his dog, following his gaze. And then he saw it. Rising from the crest of the next hill, piercing the autumn canopy like a rusted iron spear, was a watchtower. It was a skeletal structure of steel, ravaged by decades of weather, its dark frame a stark geometric wound against the organic chaos of the forest. It was tall, maybe 70 or 80 feet, with a small enclosed cabin at its peak. Tony's blood ran cold. Every instinct, every piece of training he had spent years trying to forget, snapped to the forefront of his mind. He wasn't a hiker anymore. He was a soldier on reconnaissance. His mind raced, analyzing, calculating. It made no sense. This wasn't a fire tower. It was in a low-lying valley, offering no strategic vantage point for spotting wildfires. It wasn't a cell tower. Its design was archaic, built for observation, not transmission. It wasn't on any of his topographical maps. It was a ghost, a structure that had no logical reason to exist in this specific place. It was an anomaly. And in Tony's experience, anomalies in isolated places were never a good sign. The peaceful silence of the mountains suddenly felt different. It was no longer calming. It was predatory. The feeling of unease that had settled in his gut after meeting Walter now blossomed into a cold, hard certainty. Something was deeply wrong here. Sleep did not come easily. Every time Tony closed his eyes, the image of the watchtower materialized against the blackness, a skeletal finger pointing an accusation at the sky. It was a splinter in his mind, a piece of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. The piece he had worked so hard to build felt fragile now, threatened by the rust and silence of that impossible structure. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cabin window, he had made his decision. He couldn't ignore it. The man who had once been responsible for the lives of others, who knew the cost of overlooking a single detail, could not simply walk away. Ted seemed to understand. There was no gentle wake-up call this morning. The dog was already sitting up, watching him, a low thrum of anxious energy in his posture. He knew today was different. They returned to the tower, their pace more determined, the journey stripped of its previous tranquility. As they drew closer, the scale of the thing became more intimidating. Up close, Tony could see the heavy bolts, the corroded ladder rungs climbing into the sky, the faded patches of paint clinging stubbornly to the steel. The tower was a monument to secrets, and its silence was deafening. Tony began a methodical search of the area, his eyes scanning the ground in a practiced grid pattern. But it was Ted who found it. The dog had been sniffing intently at the base of one of the tower's massive concrete footings, partially obscured by overgrown ferns and years of fallen leaves. He began to paw at the soft, damp earth, not with the playful energy of digging for a rodent, but with a focused, almost obsessive determination. A low whine started in his throat. "What have you got there, boy?" Tony asked, kneeling beside him. He brushed the loose soil away from the spot Ted had indicated. His fingers met something small, cool, and metallic. He carefully worked it free from the dirt and roots. It was a locket. It was made of silver, now a dull, tarnished gray from its long years in the earth. A delicate pattern of vines was etched around its edge. He pried open the delicate clasp with his thumbnail. It was empty, the velvet lining long since rotted away, but on the inside of the cover, 2 initials were elegantly engraved: LS. Tony's breath caught in his throat. This changed everything. The tower was no longer just an anomaly. It was now tied to a person. This small, forgotten object was a piece of someone's life, buried and lost at the foot of a structure that shouldn't exist. It felt like a clue from a ghost. He closed the locket, its cool weight feeling heavy in his palm, and stood up. His mission was no longer one of curiosity. It was now a matter of responsibility. The drive to the nearest town, Harmony Creek, took nearly an hour on winding mountain roads. The town was a small collection of brick and clapboard buildings nestled in a narrow valley, a place that felt like it was clinging to a bygone era. It was an old coal town, and the weight of that history hung in the air. The sheriff's office was a modest, single-story brick building with a faded American flag hanging limply from a pole out front. When Tony walked in, Ted at his heel, a sudden quiet fell over the room. 2 deputies, both younger men, stopped their conversation and looked up. Their eyes flickered from Tony to the large German shepherd at his side, and then quickly away, an almost rehearsed display of disinterest. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a slightly too tight uniform looked up from behind a large wooden desk. A polished nameplate read, "Sheriff Billy." His demeanor was one of relaxed, small-town authority, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "Can I help you?" Sheriff Billy asked, his voice a lazy drawl. Tony stepped forward. "Sheriff, my name is Tony. I live up on the old Miller property. I was out walking this morning and found something I thought you should see." He laid the tarnished locket on the edge of the desk. Billy picked it up, his expression unreadable. Tony explained calmly and concisely, telling him about the abandoned Watchtower, its strange location, and where Ted had found the locket. Throughout his explanation, Tony was acutely aware of the 2 deputies. They were pretending to be busy with paperwork, but their silence was tense and absolute. It was the silence of men who had been ordered not to speak. Billy turned the locket over in his thick fingers. "An old watchtower, you say? Up north of your place?" He paused. "Yeah, I think I know the one. Old Forestry Service Tower. Been out there since before I was born. As for this," he said, holding up the locket, "kids lose things in the woods all the time." Just then the phone on his desk rang. Billy picked it up. "Yeah," he said into the receiver. He listened for a moment, his eyes never leaving Tony's. His face remained impassive, but Tony saw a subtle tightening around his jaw. "Understood," he said, and hung up. The entire call lasted less than 10 seconds. When he looked back at Tony, the last trace of professional curiosity was gone. His expression was now patronizing, dismissive. "Look, son," he said, his tone shifting. "I appreciate you coming all the way down here, but we're busy. You found an old piece of junk jewelry near an old piece of junk tower. There's no crime here, just a whole lot of nothing." He slid the locket back across the desk. "You can keep it as a souvenir." Tony stared at him, the cold reality of the situation settling in his gut. The abrupt change, the tense silence of the deputies, the cryptic phone call. It was a clear and unmistakable message. He had knocked on a door he wasn't supposed to, and it had been slammed shut in his face. "All right, Sheriff," Tony said, his voice flat. He pocketed the locket. "Thanks for your time." He turned, gave a slight tug on Ted's leash, and walked out into the afternoon sun, the wall of silence closing behind him. His mind was racing. He needed a few supplies before the long drive back, and more importantly, He needed a moment to process what had just happened. He saw the town's general store across the street, its large windows displaying everything from hardware to groceries. Inside, the store was a comforting throwback to another time, with worn wooden floors and shelves packed to the ceiling. A man behind the counter looked up and gave him a warm, welcoming smile. He was in his 60s, with a neat head of white hair, a kind face, and a clean apron tied around his waist. He was the picture of a respectable small-town proprietor. "Afternoon," the man said cheerfully. "What can I get for you?" "Just need some coffee and some dog food," Tony replied, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly in the man's friendly presence. "Coming right up. Don't see you in town much," the man said, making pleasant conversation as he got the items. "I'm Abernathy. I own the place." "Tony, and this is Ted," Tony said, gesturing to the dog. "Fine-looking animal," Mr. Abernathy commented, his smile genuine. "It's good to have new folks moving into the area. It can be a quiet place, but it's a good place. Folks look out for each other here." The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the cold dismissal Tony had just received across the street. He paid for his items, thanked the man, and left. As he drove away from Harmony Creek, the friendly face of Mr. Abernathy stayed with him. It was a brief, welcome moment of normalcy, but it did nothing to shake the cold dread that was now taking root deep inside him. He had found a ghost's locket, and in trying to report it, he had discovered that the town and its law were haunted by something far more sinister. The drive back to the cabin was a silent one, filled only by the low rumble of the truck's engine and the soft panting of Ted in the passenger seat. Tony drove on autopilot, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind 1,000 miles away, replaying the scene in the sheriff's office. He dissected every word, every gesture, every flicker of an eye. It was a skill he had learned in places where a misread signal could be the difference between life and death. The initial feigned politeness from Sheriff Billy was textbook for someone sizing up a potential problem. The deputy's averted eyes were not a sign of disrespect, but of fear. They were soldiers following an order of silence. But the phone call was the tell. It was too fast, too convenient. It wasn't an interruption, it was a signal. A report had been received, and an order had been given. Dismiss the outsider. Shut it down. His thoughts drifted to the only other person he had encountered in those woods. Walter. The old man's words echoed in his head with a new, sinister weight. Some things in these woods are best left alone. Had it been a warning from a concerned neighbor, or a threat from a gatekeeper? The line between the two had become dangerously blurred. A man that territorial, that hostile to strangers, was the perfect lookout for an operation that required secrecy. The thought settled in Tony's gut like a cold stone. His suspicion of Walter hardened. That night, the familiar, comforting silence of the cabin felt different. It felt thin, fragile, like a piece of glass about to shatter. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, put him on edge. Ted seemed to feel it too. Instead of sleeping soundly at the foot of the cot, the dog lay awake, his head raised, his ears twitching at every sound. Tony lay for hours, staring at the ceiling, the tarnished silver locket sitting on the small table beside him. It was a cold piece of evidence, a silent testament to a life that had ended and a secret that refused to stay buried. He was up before sunrise, his decision made. He couldn't wait. He didn't know who he was up against or how much time he had, but he knew one thing for certain. They knew about him. He had tripped a wire, and now the enemy was aware of his position. He dressed quickly, pulling on a worn leather jacket over his flannel shirt as the morning air was damp and cold. A heavy bank of dark gray clouds was rolling in from the west, swallowing the peaks of the mountains. A storm was coming. "Stay close, Ted," he said, his voice low and serious. The dog needed no encouragement, staying so close to his side that his fur brushed against Tony's leg with every step. The journey back to the tower felt like an infiltration. He moved quietly, using the trees for cover, his senses on high alert. The forest, his sanctuary, now felt like hostile territory. As they approached the clearing where the tower stood, he slowed his pace, scanning the area before stepping into the open. At first glance, everything looked the same. The tower stood silent and imposing against the bruised purple sky. But as he got closer, his training kicked in, and he saw the small, deliberate changes. The ground at the base of the tower footing, where Ted had dug up the locket, was no longer disturbed. It had been carefully covered with fresh leaves and twigs, a clumsy attempt at camouflage that was obvious to a trained eye. He knelt down. The soil was still looser than the surrounding earth. He walked the perimeter, his eyes tracing the path they had taken the day before. Their footprints were gone. The entire area had been swept, brushed over with branches to erase any sign that they had ever been there. Confirmation, cold and absolute. His report had sent them scrambling. Someone, or some group, had come here immediately after he left the sheriff's office. They had searched the area, sanitized it, and tried to turn back the clock. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of fear and adrenaline. He was no longer just a curious civilian who had stumbled upon something. He was now a threat that needed to be managed. His mind immediately went back to Walter. The old man knew this terrain. He would have been the perfect person to send for a quick, quiet cleanup. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the dry leaves. Within minutes, the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The sky opened up, and sheets of water lashed down, soaking him to the skin in seconds. "Come on, Ted! Shelter!" Tony yelled over the roar of the rain. He spotted a rocky outcropping a short distance away, a shallow overhang that offered some meager protection from the deluge. They huddled underneath it, water streaming off the brim of Tony's hat as he watched the storm unleash its fury on the forest. Ted shivered beside him, pressing close for warmth and reassurance. Tony wrapped an arm around the dog, his own unease growing with the intensity of the storm. He watched the ground at the base of the tower turn into a muddy soup. The force of the rain was a powerful erosive force, washing away the freshly laid leaves and cutting deep rivulets into the topsoil. He was about to turn his attention away when a small glint of light caught his eye. It was near the same spot where the locket had been, a flicker of reflected light from an object being uncovered by the churning, muddy water. He waited for a slight lull in the downpour, then dashed out from under the rock. Kneeling in the mud, he scraped away the wet earth with his fingers. He pulled out a small rectangular piece of metal. It was a thin tag made of brass, green with corrosion. It was heavy, solid. He wiped the mud away with his thumb. Stamped into the metal were a series of numbers, and beneath them, the faded name of a company. Blackwood Ridge Coal, a miner's tag. He stared at it, the rain dripping from his hair onto his hands. This was a piece of the puzzle he never expected. The locket was personal, emotional. This tag was industrial, historical. It connected the personal tragedy of LS to the industrial past of this very land. Blackwood Ridge Coal had been one of the biggest mining operations in the county, but it had shut down decades ago, back in the late 1980s. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture he still couldn't fully see. A forgotten tower, a lost locket, a corrupt sheriff, a suspicious local, and now a link to a defunct coal mine. He closed his fist around the cold metal tag. The storm raged around him, but inside, a quiet, cold resolve had settled over him. He now had two pieces of evidence, two names from the past. LS and the Blackwood Ridge Coal Company. He was on his own. The local law was not just unhelpful, it was compromised. He was an outsider up against a secret that had been kept for a very long time, a secret someone was clearly willing to go to great lengths to protect. He looked down at Ted, who looked back up at him with unwavering trust. Tony knew he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. The air that filtered into the cabin was cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. For the first time since he had arrived in West Virginia, the sounds of the forest, The cheerful chirping of birds, the dripping of water from the eaves, did not bring Tony peace. They felt like a thin veil draped over a deep and unsettling quiet. He sat at his small wooden table, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands. In front of him, laid out on a clean cloth, were the two artifacts that had stolen his solitude, the tarnished silver locket and the corroded brass miner's tag. One was a symbol of a personal, intimate loss. The other was a cold, impersonal piece of a massive, long-dead machine. LS and the Blackwood Ridge Coal Company. A person and a place. Somehow, they were connected by a rusty, forgotten tower in the middle of the woods. He knew his options were limited. Going back to Sheriff Billy was not only useless, but dangerous. He had already announced his presence, and another visit would be a declaration of intent. The town, with its polite but distant faces, offered no allies. That left the woods. The people who had cleaned up the site by the tower had come from somewhere, and they had returned to that same somewhere. The rain had been a curse, washing away tracks, but it had also been a blessing, gifting him the miner's tag. His mission was clear. He had to go back and find a trail. Ted seemed to sense the shift in him. The dog, normally content to doze after their morning walk, instead sat alert by the door, watching Tony with an intelligent, questioning gaze. His presence was a silent reassurance. He was the only ally Tony needed. "All right, boy," Tony said, finally standing up and pocketing the two pieces of metal. "Let's go see what that storm left for us." They returned to the tower, the ground soft and muddy underfoot. The cleanup crew's clumsy attempt to hide their work had been completely undone by the downpour. The leaves they had spread around were now plastered in a thick, dark layer over the ground, and the soil beneath was a churned-up mess. Tony began his search, falling back on old habits, on a discipline he thought he'd left behind in the deserts of Afghanistan. He started in a spiral pattern, moving outward from the base of the tower. He looked for anything out of place, a boot print pressed deep enough to survive the rain, a snapped twig that was not from the storm, a discarded piece of trash. But the crew had been thorough, and the storm had been relentless. There was nothing. An hour passed, then another. Frustration began to set in. He was a ghost hunter, searching for traces that had been washed away into nothing. He was about to give up for the day when Ted, who had been patiently following him, suddenly grew tense. The dog's nose, which had been casually sniffing the air, dropped to the ground. A low whine started deep in his chest, and he began pulling insistently on the leash, not in the direction of the cabin, but away from the tower, toward a dense thicket of rhododendron. "What is it?" Tony murmured, his own senses sharpening. Ted wasn't following a visible path. His nose was pressed into the damp earth, zigzagging back and forth. Tony knelt, examining the ground. He couldn't see anything, but he could smell it. A faint, mineral-rich scent, different from the usual loamy smell of the forest floor. It was the scent of clay. He let Ted lead, keeping a loose grip on the leash. The dog was relentless. He pushed through the thicket, ignoring the branches that whipped at his face. On the other side, Tony saw it. Smeared on the dark trunk of a fallen log was a distinct, unmistakable patch of reddish-orange mud. It was the kind of iron-rich clay often found deep underground, the kind that would be brought to the surface during a mining operation. The cleanup crew hadn't left a footprint, but they had left a scent signature. They had carried this unique mud on their boots, and the rain, instead of erasing it, had rehydrated it, strengthening its scent for Ted's powerful nose. A surge of adrenaline shot through Tony. They had a trail. For the next 2 hours, they moved through the forest in a seamless partnership. Tony used his eyes, spotting the faintest signs of passage, a bent fern, a mossy rock scuffed by a boot heel. Ted used his nose, confirming the direction, pulling Tony forward whenever the trail went cold to the human eye. The red clay was their guide. They found it smeared on rocks, in small clumps on patches of fallen leaves, a ghostly trail of breadcrumbs, leading them deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The forest began to change. The open hardwoods gave way to denser stands of pine, and the ground grew steeper, more rugged. The air felt heavier, the silence more profound. This was a part of the forest that people did not go to. There were no deer trails here, no signs of hunters. There was only their faint, muddy path. They came across the first sign of the mine without warning. A thick steel cable, as thick as Tony's wrist, lay across their path, rusted and half swallowed by the earth. A little farther on, they saw a pile of rotting timbers, their square shapes unnatural among the trees. Then the trail opened up into a clearing, and Tony stopped dead, his breath catching in his chest. Before them lay the skeletal remains of the Blackwood Ridge coal mine. It was a place of profound desolation. A massive skeletal headframe, the structure that once lowered men and equipment into the earth, loomed over a collapsed and flooded mine shaft, its dark water stagnant and uninviting. Several buildings dotted the clearing, their roofs caved in, their windows like vacant eyes. A massive slag heap, a man-made mountain of black and gray rock waste, rose up behind the buildings, so barren that only a few sickly weeds grew on its slopes. The entire place radiated a deathly atmosphere. It was a graveyard of industry, a place of hard labor and broken dreams, now left to be reclaimed by the forest. But the forest seemed to want no part of it. The silence here was different. It wasn't the living silence of the deep woods. It was the hollow, empty silence of a tomb. Ted pressed against Tony's leg, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog could feel it too, the wrongness of this place. Tony stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes taking in the scene. The miner's tag in his pocket suddenly felt heavy, like a key he had just found for a lock he was terrified to open. This was it. This was the source. This was where the men who had cleaned up the tower had come from. This was where the secrets were buried. He looked at the collapsed mine shaft, then at the dilapidated foreman's office. Somewhere in this industrial graveyard, he would find his answers. The thought filled him not with triumph, but with a deep and chilling dread. The air in the clearing was thick and still, heavy with the metallic scent of rust and damp coal dust. Tony stood for a long moment, his hand resting on Ted's back, the dog's warmth a small comfort against the profound coldness of the place. The abandoned mine was a monument to forgotten labor and lost lives, and every derelict building seemed to watch them with hollow, judgmental eyes. His training guided his decision. In any abandoned site, the heart of its history, its secrets, was most likely to be found in its administrative center. He set his sights on the largest of the smaller buildings, a single-story structure with a collapsed porch and a faded sign that read, "Foreman's Office." "All right, Ted," Tony said softly, his voice barely disturbing the silence. "Let's see what they left behind." The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a scene of absolute decay. A large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, its surface warped and blistered from decades of moisture. An overturned chair lay beside it like a fallen soldier. Papers, letters, and logbooks were scattered across the floor, but they were little more than pale, pulpy masses. Their ink bled into illegible brown stains. The air was thick with the smell of mold and wet rot. Time and neglect had devoured nearly everything. Tony moved through the room with care, his boots crunching on shattered glass from the single grimy window. He sifted through the debris, but it was a hopeless task. Nothing was salvageable. Whatever records had been kept here were now just organic matter, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. He felt a pang of disappointment. The trail had led him here, to this dead end, a room full of stories that could no longer be read. He was about to turn and leave, to search one of the other decaying structures, when he realized Ted was no longer by his side. The dog was standing in the far corner of the room, away from the desk and the main piles of debris. He was completely still, his body rigid, his nose pointed at the floor. A low, quiet whine, the same sound he had made at the tower, rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Tony asked, his voice hushed. Ted didn't look at him. He lifted a paw and deliberately tapped it on one of the wide wooden floorboards. Then he looked at Tony, his intelligent eyes insistent. He tapped the board again. Tony's heart began to beat faster. He trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. Ted wasn't just sniffing a rat's nest. This was different. This was the same focused intensity he had shown before finding the locket. Tony knelt down, running his hands over the floorboard. It felt solid, just like the others. But when he pressed down on the far edge, it gave way slightly, producing a faint squeak that the others did not. He needed a tool. A quick search of the rubble outside yielded a rusted-out tire iron, heavy and solid in his hand. Back inside, he wedged the flattened end into the seam and pried. The old wood groaned in protest, the nails screeching as they were pulled from the joists below. The board came loose. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity, a hidden compartment deliberately cut between the floor joists. And nestled inside, protected from the dampness and decay that had consumed the rest of the room, was a metal box. It was a simple, dark green document box, the kind a person might keep important papers in. Its corners were rusted, and its paint was flaking, but it was intact. With a sense of reverence, Tony lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than he expected. He carried it over to the relative brightness of the grimy window and sat on the floor, placing it carefully in front of him. The latch was stiff but not locked. He worked it open with a metallic groan. He lifted the lid. The first things he saw were a stack of newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle with age. He carefully lifted one. It was from the Blackwood County Ledger, dated 1988. The headline read, "Mine Collapse Traps 3." He read the short article, his stomach tightening. Another clipping from 1989, local miner reported missing, foul play not suspected. A third from 1987, safety concerns raised at Blackwood Ridge. It was a litany of tragedies, a chronicle of the danger that had been a daily reality for the men who worked here. Beneath the clippings was a rolled-up tube of paper tied with a piece of twine that crumbled at his touch. He carefully unrolled it. It was a detailed surveyor's map of the Blackwood Ridge mine, showing the intricate network of shafts and tunnels that snaked for miles beneath their feet. But it was the handwritten additions that drew his attention. Someone had used a blue pen to circle several areas deep within the mine, with terse, anxious notes scribbled beside them. Unstable shoring, gas pocket, and next to a remote shaft, a single, chilling word. Blocked. At the very bottom of the box, lying face up, was a photograph. It was black and white, the edges curled and faded. Tony picked it up with a hand that was not quite steady. The image swam into focus, and the air left his lungs in a silent rush. It was a picture of a man in his late 20s wearing dusty overalls and a helmet, a headlamp fixed to the front. His face was smudged with coal dust, but it couldn't hide the wide, proud smile that lit up his features. He was holding a little girl in his arms. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, with bright, curious eyes and a cheerful grin that mirrored her father's. A ribbon was tied in her dark hair. The man was looking not at the camera, but down at his daughter, with an expression of pure, unconditional love that transcended the faded monochrome image. Tony knew, with an absolute and gut-wrenching certainty, who he was looking at. This was L.S. This was the man who had worn the locket. This was the man who had hidden this box, who had scribbled warnings on the map. This was the man who had disappeared. He sank back against the wall, the photograph held gently in his hands. The ghost of the mine suddenly had a face. The abstract mystery, the intellectual puzzle of the tower, and the clues dissolved into a raw, human tragedy. This wasn't about a conspiracy anymore. It was about this man, this smiling father who went to work one day and never came home. It was about the little girl in the picture, a girl who would now be a woman in her 30s, a woman who had grown up without a father, perhaps never knowing what truly happened to him. A deep, cold anger began to smolder within Tony, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was the same protective rage he had felt, seeing his men in danger, the same fire that had burned in him when he saw injustice. For years, he had tried to bury that man, the soldier who cared too much, the man who took responsibility for everything. He had come to these mountains to escape him. But looking at the photograph, he realized he couldn't. The investigation was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. It was a duty owed to the smiling man in the picture. It was a promise to the little girl with the ribbon in her hair. It was a mission, personal and deeply honorable. He would find out what happened to LS. He would give him a voice. He carefully placed the map and the clippings back into the box, but he kept the photograph, tucking it securely into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. As he and Ted stepped out of the foreman's office and back into the desolate clearing, the oppressive silence of the mine no longer felt empty. It felt like it was waiting. The journey back from the mine was a long, silent march. The oppressive atmosphere of the place clung to Tony like the damp chill of the forest, a weight that settled deep in his bones. He carried the metal box in his arms, its contents feeling far heavier than their physical mass. Ted walked close beside him, occasionally nudging his hand with his nose, a silent question, a gesture of support. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. The woods were no longer their sanctuary. They were a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Back in the cabin, with the door bolted and the single kerosene lamp casting a warm, flickering glow, Tony carefully laid out the contents of the box on the table. The brittle newspaper clippings, the hand-annotated map, and the faded photograph of LS and his daughter. He spent hours poring over them, trying to piece together a story from the fragments of a life. He read the articles about the mine's safety violations and the quiet disappearances until the words blurred. He traced the lines on the map, trying to understand the significance of the circled areas, the scribbled warnings. But his eyes kept returning to the photograph. The image was a powerful anchor in a sea of cold facts. It was the human cost, the tangible proof of the life that had been stolen. He saw his own search for peace reflected in the man's proud, tired smile. He saw the innocence he fought to protect in the little girl's bright, trusting eyes. He felt a profound connection to this man he had never met, a bond forged across decades by a shared love for family and a life of hard work. He was no longer just an investigator, he was a witness. He fell asleep at the table, his head resting on his arms, the lamp burning low. His dreams were a chaotic swirl of rusted towers, dark tunnels, and the smiling face of the man in the photograph. He woke to the first light of morning, a dull ache in his neck and a cold resolve in his heart. The fear and dread of the previous day had burned away through the night, leaving behind something harder, something more focused. He made coffee, the familiar ritual, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and hostile. He sat on the edge of the porch, the warm mug in his hands, and watched the mist rise from the valley below. Ted sat beside him, his head resting on Tony's knee, a comforting, solid weight. For a moment, it was almost possible to believe that everything was normal. The sun was rising, the birds were singing, and the mountains stood silent and majestic as they had for millennia. This was the peace he had come here for. This quiet moment, with his loyal companion by his side, was the only thing in the world that truly mattered to him. It was his home. It was his life. And he would not let anyone take it from him. He finished his coffee, stood up, and stretched. It was time to start the day. He unlatched the cabin door and swung it open to let Ted out for his morning run. And then he froze. There, on the rough wooden planks of his doorstep, placed dead center, where it could not possibly be missed, was a single rifle cartridge. It was not dropped. It was not lost. It was placed. It was clean, the brass casing polished to a dull shine, the copper-jacketed lead tip pointing directly at the open door. It was a message, as clear and articulate as a written threat, but colder, more personal. It was a symbol of silent, lethal power. We know where you live. We can reach you. Stop. Tony's training slammed into him like a physical blow. The peaceful cabin owner vanished, and the soldier took his place. In a split second, his mind registered the details, analyzed the threat. His eyes immediately snapped up, scanning the dense tree line that surrounded his cabin, searching for the glint of a rifle scope, a flicker of movement. He saw nothing but leaves shifting in the breeze. "Ted, inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. The dog, sensing the sudden absolute shift in his master's demeanor, immediately backed into the cabin without a sound. Tony quickly knelt, never taking his eyes off the woods, and picked up the bullet. He backed into the cabin and shut the door, sliding the heavy bolt home with a solid thud. His heart was pounding, a wild drum against his ribs. He stood in the center of the room, the cartridge cold in his palm, his mind racing. Who? How? The cleanup crew from the tower knew the general area, but his cabin was isolated, hidden. Finding it would take time, skill. And then one image flooded his mind, sharp and clear. Walter's hostile face, the way he held his rifle, the warning in his gravelly voice. This ain't a place for sightseeing. The man was territorial. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He had been the first person to warn him, the first person to show aggression, and he lived close by. A surge of conviction, hot and absolute, washed over Tony. It was Walter. He was the lookout, the enforcer. He had to be. The fear, for a moment, was a cold, sharp thing. He was alone, outgunned, against an enemy with unknown numbers and resources. He had no one to call, no one to trust. He looked around the small cabin, his sanctuary, and it suddenly felt like a trap, a flimsy wooden box surrounded by unseen predators. Then he looked down at Ted. The dog was sitting at his feet, looking up at him, his body tense, but his eyes filled with a calm, unwavering trust. He was not afraid because Tony was here. And in that moment, the fear that had gripped Tony's heart was burned away by a sudden, volcanic eruption of rage. It was an old, familiar feeling, an anger he had tried for years to suppress, to leave behind in the dust and the sand. It was the cold fury of a protector whose line had been crossed. These people, whoever they were, had not just threatened him. They had invaded his home. They had threatened the one pure, innocent thing in his life. They had threatened his dog. They had made a grave mistake. They thought this bullet would scare him, would make him run. But they didn't know the man they were dealing with. They had no idea who they had just awakened. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who would now use every hard-learned lesson from that past to defend his future. He closed his hand around the bullet, its sharp edges digging into his palm. The fight for LS memory, for the little girl in the photograph, was now intertwined with his own fight for survival. His peaceful sanctuary had been turned into a battlefield, and he would not lose. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It had become a command post. The bullet sat on the table next to the locket and the miner's tag, a cold trinity of evidence. The initial surge of rage had subsided, leaving in its wake a state of hyper-focused clarity. The soldier Tony had tried to bury was now fully in command, his mind operating with a cold, methodical precision. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. It was a liability that got people killed. His first priority was intelligence. He unrolled the old surveyor's map from the metal box, its brittle paper crangling in protest. He weighed down its corners with books and studied the intricate, hand-drawn network of tunnels. The map was a relic, a snapshot of the Earth from decades ago. To make it useful, he needed to align it with the present. He pulled out a modern, detailed topographical map of the county he had bought when he first moved here. For the next hour, he worked with the intense concentration of a cartographer. He used the main mine entrance, the slag heap, and the few remaining permanent structures as anchor points, carefully overlaying the old map with the new one. He traced the ghost tunnels of the Blackwood Ridge mine onto the modern landscape, his pencil moving with slow, deliberate strokes. Finally, he had a composite map, a guide to the secret world beneath his feet. His eyes were drawn to the areas the miner, LS, had circled in blue ink. Most of them were deep within the main network of tunnels, but one stood out. It was a secondary shaft, located on the far side of the ridge, far from the main complex. The note beside it was the one that had chilled him to the bone. Blocked. Why would a miner, concerned with safety, note that a remote shaft was blocked? A cave-in would be a major event, recorded in official logs. This felt different. This felt like a deliberate, man-made seal. He drew a small X on his own map. That was his destination. He prepared for the journey as he would for a patrol in hostile territory. He packed a small bag with a powerful flashlight, a length of rope, a canteen of water, and a first aid kit. He dressed in dark, earth-toned clothing that would blend in with the forest. The final item he checked was a heavy, fixed-blade knife he kept strapped to his belt. It felt inadequate, but it was all he had. "All right, Ted," he said, his voice low. "Let's go." The dog seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. There was no excited tail wagging, no playful nudges. Ted followed him out to the old pickup truck, his body alert, his head constantly scanning the trees. Tony tossed his gear onto the passenger floor, and Ted hopped into the seat, a silent, gray shadow. Tony drove with a newfound caution, taking a series of winding, unpaved logging roads that climbed deeper into the mountains. He avoided the main highways, his eyes constantly flicking to his rearview mirror, searching for any sign of a tail. The truck rumbled and bounced over the rough terrain, the dense forest canopy forming a tunnel of green around them. After 45 minutes of tense driving, he consulted his composite map. He was as close as any vehicle could get. He found a small, overgrown clearing and pulled the truck deep into a thicket of pines, concealing it from the main track. He cut the engine, and the silence of the deep woods rushed in. From here, they would proceed on foot. They moved through the woods with practiced stealth. Tony avoided open spaces, sticking to the dense cover of the trees. He moved slowly, his senses taking in every detail, the snap of a twig, the call of a distant bird, the direction of the wind. He was no longer a man enjoying a hike. He was an operator moving through an environment that contained an active threat. Their final approach took them up a steep, thickly wooded ridge. The forest here was older, wilder. The trees were massive, their ancient branches blocking out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. After a hard 30-minute climb, he checked his map again. They were close. It was Ted who gave the first warning. The dog, who had been moving with silent confidence, suddenly stopped. The fur on his neck bristled. He lowered his head, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure revulsion. He took a hesitant step back, whining, and looked up at Tony with wide, distressed eyes. "What is it, boy?" Tony whispered, placing a hand on his back. Ted was trembling. Then Tony smelled it. At first it was faint, a sour, acrid note on the wind that was completely alien to the natural scents of the forest. It was a sharp chemical odor, something like ammonia or bleach, a smell that spoke of attempts to scrub something clean. He took a few more steps forward, pushing through a final screen of dense ferns, and the smell hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was overpowering, a thick, nauseating stench that made his eyes water and his stomach churn. Beneath the harsh chemical smell was something else, something ancient and horribly organic. It was the cloying, sickly sweet odor of decay, a smell that evolution had hardwired into the human brain to scream one single, primal word: death. He had found it. Before him was a small, rocky clearing at the base of a cliff. The entrance to the mine shaft was almost completely hidden, sealed with a chaotic jumble of old timbers, loose rock, and packed earth. To a casual observer, it would look like a simple rock slide, a natural cave-in from long ago. But Tony could see the telltale signs of deliberate work, the unnatural angles of the timbers, the way the earth had been piled up and not just fallen. This was the place LS had marked. This was the place that had been blocked. He took a step closer, pulling the collar of his shirt over his nose to ward off the worst of the stench. The smell was seeping from a dozen tiny cracks and fissures in the blockade, a foul breath escaping from a tomb. Ted refused to come any closer, his whining growing more agitated. The dog's instinct was screaming at him that this was a place of profound wrongness, a place of death. Tony stood before the sealed entrance, his mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening force. The disappearances from the old newspaper clippings, the secret notes from a terrified miner, the modern-day cleanup crew, the drug operation that needed a place to hide its secrets, its failures, its victims. This wasn't just a blocked-off mine shaft, it was a makeshift mausoleum. He was standing at the entrance to a mass grave. LS wasn't just missing. He was in there, somewhere in the cold, dark earth, along with who knew how many others. A wave of nausea and grief washed over him, followed by a surge of ice-cold resolve. The photograph in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his jacket. The smiling face of the young father, the trusting eyes of his little girl. They were his responsibility now. He was their only voice. He looked at the formidable wall of rock and timber, at the foul stench that promised unimaginable horrors within. He knew that to go forward was to step into a world of darkness from which he might not return. The quiet, peaceful life he had sought was gone forever, destroyed by the secrets this mountain held. He took a deep, steadying breath, the foul air searing his lungs. He was ready. He had to know what was inside. The stench from the sealed mine shaft was a visceral assault, a constant reminder of the horrors that lay hidden within. Tony stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, the faint light of his powerful flashlight cutting through the thick, stagnant air. Ted, still trembling slightly, nudged his hand, a silent plea to turn back. But Tony knew there was no turning back now. LS and his family deserved the truth. He began the arduous task of clearing the entrance. The blockage, though designed to look like a natural collapse, was crude enough that a determined man with basic tools could force an entry. He used the tire iron from the foreman's office, along with a sturdy, pointed rock, to chip away at the packed earth and pry loose the rotting timbers. It was slow, back-breaking work, each dislodged piece releasing a fresh wave of the foul, chemical-laced air. He worked silently, methodically, his every muscle straining, fueled by a grim determination. Ted sat patiently behind him, occasionally letting out a soft, mournful whimper. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough for him to squeeze through. He shone his flashlight into the black maw. The tunnel was narrow, steeply sloped, and the air was thick, suffocating. He secured one end of his rope to a sturdy root outside, then clipped the other end to his belt, a lifeline to the world above. "Stay here, Ted," he whispered, patting the dog's head. "Guard the entrance. I'll be back." Ted let out a low growl, a sound of protest mixed with understanding. He watched Tony squeeze through the narrow opening, his silver-gray form disappearing into the absolute darkness. The air inside was even worse, a suffocating cocktail of ammonia, stale human sweat, and the cloying sweetness of decaying organic matter. Tony coughed, trying to pull his shirt collar higher over his nose and mouth, but it did little good. He moved slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness, revealing rough-hewn rock walls and a floor slick with moisture and loose shale. Every step echoed unnervingly in the oppressive silence. He followed the tunnel as it snaked downwards, deeper into the earth. The air grew heavier, warmer, and the chemical smell intensified. He started to hear faint, rhythmic sounds. A low hum, like machinery, and a distant, almost imperceptible thud. His heart began to pound, a frantic drum against his ribs. He was close. The tunnel finally opened into a larger cavern, carved out of the solid rock. Tony pressed himself against the rough wall, switching off his flashlight and letting his eyes adjust to the faint, flickering light that emanated from within. What he saw confirmed his deepest fears and surpassed his wildest imaginings. This was no abandoned mine shaft. It was a clandestine drug laboratory operating on a massive scale. The cavern was a hive of activity. Large industrial-grade equipment, stainless steel tanks, distillation columns, ventilation fans, hummed and whorrobbed, filling the air with a cacophony of sound. Workbenches lined the walls, littered with glassware, chemicals, and what looked like stacks of white powder. Several figures moved about, their faces obscured by the dim light and the makeshift respirators they wore over their mouths and noses. Their clothing was practical, dark, and nondescript. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was a sophisticated, well-funded criminal enterprise hidden deep within the earth, using the forgotten infrastructure of the old Blackwood Ridge mine as its cover. The sheer audacity of it left Tony momentarily breathless. He watched, concealed in the shadows, his mind furiously trying to piece together the operation. He saw bags of raw materials being moved, the glint of needles and syringes on a table, the careful pouring of liquids from one container to another. He realized with sickening clarity that the chemical stench was from the precursor chemicals, the raw ingredients for the drugs they were manufacturing, and the smell of decay. That was from the unfortunate souls who had stumbled upon this place, or perhaps those who had simply served their purpose. The realization sent a cold shudder down his spine. LS was likely just one of many. Just then, a voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the hum of the machinery. "Status report. We need a clean burn on that last batch by midnight." Tony flinched, instinctively pressing himself further into the rock. The voice was coming from a small, improvised office built into a corner of the cavern, constructed from plywood and tarpaulins. A single figure, larger than the others, was speaking into a handheld radio. The light was dim, but Tony could make out the general shape of the man. Broad shoulders, a somewhat portly build. "The product is ready, boss," a rough voice replied from the cavern floor. "Just waiting on the transport confirmation." "Good, and I want that old entrance secured better. We had a civilian poke around the tower. Could be nothing, could be trouble. Billy says he shut him down, but you can't be too careful." The man in the office paused. "And make sure everything's clean. No loose ends. Understand?" Tony's blood ran cold, not just from the words, but from the voice itself. It was rich, deep, and familiar. The words echoed Mr. Abernathy's cheerful, respectable tones, but twisted by an undercurrent of ruthlessness that was chillingly unsettling. The owner of Harmony Creek's general store, the pillar of the community, was the man running this operation. The revelation hit Tony with the force of a hammer blow. He had been so wrong about Walter, and so dangerously naive about Abernathy. As the realization settled, the sheer scale of the danger he was in became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just dealing with some local thugs. He was up against a meticulously organized criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching deep into the community, controlling the local law, and run by a man who projected an image of perfect respectability. He had walked straight into the lion's den, deep underground, completely alone. He needed to get out. He needed to get out now and warn someone. His mind, honed by years of combat, instantly began planning his extraction. He couldn't engage. He was outmanned, outgunned, and deep in enemy territory. His mission was no longer to find answers. It was to survive and to bring this information to light. He had seen enough. He had seen the truth, cold and undeniable, of LS's fate and the horrifying depth of the corruption that had swallowed this part of West Virginia. He began to slowly, carefully, back away from the mouth of the cavern, keeping to the deepest shadows, his heart thumping in his chest, a desperate rhythm of survival. Adrenaline was afire in Tony's veins. He moved backward through the dark tunnel, his every sense screaming, his body a coiled spring of tension. The sounds of the lab, the hum of the fans, the clink of glassware, the murmur of voices, seemed to grow louder with every step he took away from it, as if the cavern itself was trying to pull him back in. His flashlight remained off, his hands tracing the rough, damp wall of the tunnel as he navigated the absolute darkness. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few minutes before he saw it, a faint gray rectangle of light. The entrance. He squeezed through the opening and tumbled out into the fresh, clean air of the forest, gasping, his lungs burning from the foul atmosphere of the mine. A wet nose and a frantic, whining welcome met him instantly. Ted was all over him, licking his face, circling him, his body racked with a relief so profound it was almost human. Tony wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his thick silver fur. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's okay. We're out." But he knew it wasn't okay. They were out of the tunnel, but they were far from safe. They were standing on the doorstep of a monster. He worked quickly, piling rocks and timbers back into the opening, doing his best to make it look undisturbed. It was a crude effort, but it might buy him some time. As he worked, his mind was already miles away, formulating a plan. He was one man against an entrenched criminal organization with the local law in its pocket. He had no illusions about his chances in a direct confrontation. His only hope was to get the information to someone on the outside, someone with the power to bring the full weight of the federal government down on this place. There was only one person he could trust. Jason. Jason had been his team leader in the service before a career-ending injury in 2017 had led him to a second, quieter life as a field agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man who understood the way the world worked, both the clean parts and the dirty. More importantly, he was a man to whom Tony had once entrusted his life, and who had done the same in return. Their bond was forged in the kind of fire that never truly goes out. Reaching him was the problem. His personal cell phone was a liability, easily tracked. He needed to get to a higher elevation for a clear signal and use a cheap, disposable burner phone he kept in his truck for emergencies. He and Ted made their way back to his truck, moving with a desperate urgency, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. He drove, not back toward his cabin, but up a winding state highway that climbed to a scenic overlook on the next ridge. The higher he got, the more exposed he felt. He found the overlook empty in the late afternoon and made the call. It was answered on the second ring. "Yeah," Jason's familiar clipped voice said. "It's me," Tony said, his own voice low. "I have a situation. It's big." There was a pause on the other end. "How big?" "Big enough to bury a town," Tony replied, choosing his words carefully. "Local law is compromised. The whole setup is deep. I have physical evidence and a location." He could almost hear the gears turning in Jason's mind. "Are you secure?" "Negative. I think my cover is blown. I need to get this to you." "Name the time and place," Jason said, his voice all business. Tony gave him the coordinates for a remote, abandoned ranger station 2 hours away, a place he had scouted on his maps. "Sunrise, come alone." "Understood," Jason said. "Stay off the grid. And Tony, stay alive." The line went dead. The call was made. Now he just had to make it to the rendezvous. He tossed the burner phone far into the woods and started the truck, pulling back onto the highway. The race had begun. He drove with a controlled, steady speed, his eyes constantly flicking to his rearview mirror. For the first 20 minutes, the road behind him was clear, but as he rounded a long, sweeping curve, he saw it. A dark green pickup truck, the kind used for hauling feed and supplies. It was the same make and model as the one he had seen parked behind Abernathy's general store. It was keeping a steady, deliberate distance, neither closing the gap nor falling behind. It was a tail. This was the confirmation. Abernathy's voice on the radio hadn't been a coincidence. They knew he had been in the mine, and now they were coming for him. His training took over completely. He pushed down the surge of fear and replaced it with cold, hard calculation. He was being followed, which meant they didn't just want to stop him. They wanted to see where he was going. It also meant an ambush was likely waiting for him somewhere up ahead. They would try to box him in. He thought of the roads, visualizing the map in his head. Up ahead was a major intersection where the state highway met a smaller county road. It was the logical place to set up a roadblock. But just before that intersection, he remembered seeing it on his explorations. A barely visible track, an old logging road that cut straight into the forest. It would be rough, maybe impassable, but it was his only chance. That was his escape route. He kept his speed steady, giving no indication that he had spotted them. He needed them to believe he was an oblivious civilian heading straight for their trap. The green truck stayed behind him like a loyal shadow. Miles ticked by. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the road. They were less than a mile from the intersection. Tony's hands tightened on the wheel. He could feel Ted beside him, the dog sensing the intense, focused energy radiating from him. The dog stood up on the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window, a low growl beginning to build in his throat. They rounded the final bend before the turnoff. And then it happened. Ted exploded. It wasn't a normal bark. It was a violent, frantic eruption of sound, a savage, furious roar directed at the dense patch of woods just ahead of them, at the very spot where the logging road met the highway. He lunged against the dashboard, his teeth bared, his body a trembling mass of protective fury. That was all the confirmation Tony needed. He didn't wait to see the ambush. He didn't hesitate. He trusted his dog's senses as much as he trusted his own. In one fluid motion, he wrenched the steering wheel to the right. The truck screeched in protest, tires screaming as it left the smooth pavement and slammed onto the rough, overgrown surface of the logging road. The impact was jarring. Branches scraped and clawed at the sides of the truck with a deafening shriek. The vehicle bucked and fishtailed on the muddy track, but Tony held it steady, his foot hard on the accelerator. In his rearview mirror, he caught a fleeting glimpse of two dark figures stepping out onto the highway from the cover of the trees, rifles in their hands, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury as their trap was sprung, empty. The green pickup truck behind them swerved, trying to follow, but it was too late and the angle was too sharp. Tony pushed his own truck harder, deeper into the forest, the logging road a barely visible tunnel through the trees. After another mile of the punishing terrain, he knew they had lost them. He slowed the truck to a stop, the engine ticking in the sudden, profound silence. His heart was hammering, his knuckles ached, but he was clear. They were safe. He turned to Ted, who was panting, his eyes still wide with adrenaline. Tony reached over and pulled the dog into a fierce hug, burying his face in his neck. "You did it, boy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was part gratitude, part awe. "You did it. You saved us." Ted responded with a soft whine and a frantic lick to his face. In that moment, Tony knew that the bond between them was more than loyalty. It was a perfect, unspoken trust, a partnership that had just been tested in the crucible of life and death and had emerged unbreakable. They had survived. Now they had to finish the fight. The world was painted in shades of gray and purple when Tony reached the abandoned ranger station. Dawn was a promise, not yet a reality, and a thick mist clung to the ground, muffling all sound. He cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was absolute. He was exhausted, his body aching, his mind a raw nerve, but he was alert. He sat in the truck, a silent sentinel with Ted at his side, and waited. Just as the first sliver of the sun crested the distant ridge, a pair of headlights cut through the fog. A nondescript black sedan pulled up, and a man got out. He was tall, athletic, with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. This was Jason. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, but he moved with the quiet, coiled confidence of a man who was always in control. There were no wasted words. Tony got out of his truck, the metal box in his hands. "You look like hell, Tony," Jason said, his voice a low, serious rumble. It was the only acknowledgement of their shared history he allowed. "It's been a long night," Tony replied. He opened the box and laid out its contents on the hood of the sedan. The locket, the miner's tag, the annotated map. In the cool morning light, they looked like relics from a forgotten world. Tony then delivered his report, his voice flat and precise, detailing everything he had seen. The lab, the scale of the operation, Sheriff Billy's complicity, and the voice on the radio that belonged to the town's most respected citizen, Mr. Abernathy. Jason listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the evidence. He picked up the locket, his expression grim. "LS," he said, reading the initials. "We'll find out who he was." He looked at Tony, and in his eyes, Tony saw the unwavering resolve of a man who would see this through to the end. "You did good work. Now let us handle it. Go home, lock your door, and stay put. This is our fight now." Tony did as he was told. The next 2 days were a blur of tension and waiting. He stayed in his cabin, the world outside feeling distant and unreal. On the third morning, he heard it, the faint, rhythmic thumping of helicopters in the distance. He went out onto his porch and saw them, 3 black shapes flying low and fast over the ridges, heading in the direction of the Blackwood Ridge mine. The cavalry had arrived. The news broke that evening. A special report interrupted the local broadcast. A massive, multi-agency raid. A sophisticated drug manufacturing facility uncovered in a defunct coal mine. The anchorwoman's voice was a mixture of shock and professional gravity as the names of the arrested were read. Sheriff Billy, his face a mask of disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. Several of his deputies. And then the image that sent a tremor through the entire county. Mr. Abernathy, the kind, friendly owner of the general store, his face pale and slack with shock, being placed in the back of a federal vehicle. The report mentioned that while the local cell had been dismantled, the suspected ringleader, known only through offshore accounts and encrypted communications, had likely escaped the net. Justice had been served, but it was incomplete. A week later, Tony drove into Harmony Creek. The atmosphere was unrecognizable. The wall of tense silence had shattered, replaced by a storm of whispers, rumors, and open speculation. People gathered on street corners, in the aisles of the now federally sealed general store, talking in hushed, animated tones. They were a community waking from a long, collective nightmare, trying to understand how the rot had run so deep. As Tony walked down the street, some people looked away, their faces a mixture of shame and resentment. Others met his gaze and gave him a slow, deliberate nod of thanks. He was the outsider who had exposed the sickness they had been too afraid to even name. There was one last piece of business he had to attend to. He drove out to Walter's property and found the old man splitting firewood, his movements slow and methodical. Walter looked up as he approached, and for the first time there was no hostility in his eyes, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. "I heard it was you," Walter said, his voice raspy. "I'm sorry for trespassing on your land," Tony said. "I thought you were part of it." Walter let out a short, bitter laugh. "Part of it? They took my son." He leaned his axe against the chopping block. "He was a good boy, worked the mine back when it was still running. This was in 1989. He started hearing things, seeing things that didn't add up. Men coming and going at odd hours from that old shaft on the ridge. He started asking questions." Walter's gaze became distant, lost in a painful memory. "One day he just didn't come home. Didn't come. They said it was a cave-in. Never found the body. I knew it was a lie." He looked at Tony, his eyes glistening. "I've been living next to his tomb for more than 30 years. My anger, it wasn't at you. It was at the whole damn world for letting them get away with it. I just wanted to be left alone with my ghosts." "They found remains in the mine," Tony said softly. "The DEA is running identifications. LS was his name. The man in the locket." Walter nodded slowly. "Leonard Schofield. He was my boy's best friend. A good man. Had a little girl." They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 solitary men bound by a shared second-hand grief. "Thank you," Walter finally said, the words heavy with the weight of decades. "For giving them a voice." Back at his cabin, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the mountains, Tony felt a sense of quiet he hadn't known before. It wasn't the empty, fragile silence he had been chasing, the kind meant to drown out the ghosts of his past. It was something new, something earned. He took out the photograph of LS and his daughter one last time. He had failed to save a man in his squad all those years ago, and the guilt had followed him, haunted him, and driven him into this self-imposed exile. He had come here to run from that responsibility. But by seeking justice for this forgotten miner, by using the very skills he had tried to bury, he had found a strange and unexpected path to redemption. He hadn't found the quiet peace he was looking for. Instead, he had found solace. It was the solace that comes from action, from purpose, from honoring the dead by protecting the living. He hadn't escaped his past, but he had finally made peace with it. He placed the photograph carefully in the metal box along with the locket and the map. He would give it to Jason to find its way back to the little girl with the ribbon in her hair, who was now a woman with a story to hear. He stepped out onto the porch, Ted coming to sit beside him, resting his head on his knee. They looked out at the vast, silent mountains. The world was still a dangerous place. The true ringleader was still out there. But for the first time in a very long time, Tony felt ready to face it. He was not a man in hiding anymore. He was a guardian, and he was home. The deepest lessons in life often come not from the noise of the world, but from the silent loyalty of a friend who walks beside us through our darkest valleys. The bond between a human and an animal has a unique power to heal, reminding us that the greatest strength is not found in being unbreakable, but in the courage to trust and love again. If these stories of unbreakable bonds and quiet courage speak to your heart, we invite you to become part of our pack by subscribing. Feel free to share this tale with someone you know, and we would be honored to read about the loyal companion in your life in the comments below. Your next story is ready and waiting for you, right on the screen.